February 1943. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus emerges from the ruins of Stalingrad, gaunt, defeated, the first German field marshal in history to be taken prisoner in battle. Behind him, 90,000 men surrender to the Soviet army. 300,000 are already dead. It is one of the most catastrophic military failures in modern history. But Paulus was not alone. Across 5 years of global war, a small number of senior commanders made decisions so catastrophic, so consequential, and in some cases so avoidable, that the outcomes they produced changed the course of the conflict entirely. They were not all weak men. Several were decorated veterans, respected strategists, and experienced commanders. But at critical moments that history would not allow to pass unnoticed, they hesitated when they should have acted when they should have hesitated, or convinced themselves that the situation was manageable when the evidence said otherwise. This is the story of 4 generals whose failures did not happen in isolation. They happened inside systems of command, pressure, and denial that made catastrophe almost inevitable. And by the time each of them understood what they had done, the damage was irreversible. May 10th, 1940. Germany launches Fall Gelb, the invasion of Western Europe. Within 6 weeks, France, the most heavily defended nation on the continent, has surrendered. A country that had spent 20 years preparing for another German war ceases to exist as a military power in the time it takes most nations to mobilize. At the center of that collapse stood General Maurice Gamelin, supreme commander of the Allied forces in France. Gamelin was 70 years old, a veteran of the First World War and the architect of France's defensive strategy. That strategy rested on a single assumption, that any German attack through the Ardennes forest was operationally impossible. The terrain was too dense, the roads too narrow, the logistics too complex. The Ardennes, French military doctrine declared, was impassable for armored formations. It was not impassable. On May 10th, Army Group A, spearheaded by Panzer divisions under Erich von Manstein's plan, pushed through the Ardennes at speed and emerged behind the Allied line. 7 Panzer divisions crossed the Meuse at Sedan within days. The entire strategic logic of France's defense had been built around a penetration point that French High Command had declared impossible. Gamelin's response was paralysis. He issued no coherent counter-order during the critical hours when a concentrated armored response might still have closed the breach. His command structure was so centralized and so reliant on telephone communications that information moved too slowly to produce timely decisions. On May 19th, 9 days into the invasion, he was dismissed and replaced by Maxime Weygand. It was already too late. France fell on June 22nd. Gamelin survived the war under house arrest. He was tried after liberation, but charges were eventually dropped. He lived until 1958, writing memoirs that distributed blame with remarkable generosity to everyone but himself. The 6 weeks that destroyed France's military power in 1940 remain for historians of operational failure, the defining case study of what happens when a command system mistakes planning for preparation. February 15th, 1942. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrenders Singapore to a Japanese force roughly half the size of his own. Winston Churchill calls it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British military history. Percival commanded over 80,000 Commonwealth troops. His opponent, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, had driven down the Malayan Peninsula at a pace that defied Allied projections. Bicycles, captured fuel, and aggressive momentum covering over 1,000 kilometers in 70 days. When Japanese forces crossed the Johor Strait onto Singapore Island on February 8th, Percival faced a choice. He could launch the aggressive counterattack his numbers theoretically allowed, or he could consolidate, conserve water supplies, which were being cut. and request terms. He chose the latter. His reasoning was not irrational. Water reserves were critically low. His formations were exhausted and poorly positioned. A prolonged urban battle risked civilian casualties on a catastrophic scale. But what followed, the image of Percival walking toward Japanese lines carrying a white flag, became one of the most enduring symbols of imperial overconfidence meeting operational reality. The deeper failure was systemic and predated Percival. Singapore's famous coastal defenses pointed seaward. The landward approaches had been under-fortified for years, partly because British strategic planning had assumed any serious threat would arrive by sea. Percival inherited a fortress that was, in one critical direction, not a fortress at all. He spent the war as a prisoner of the Japanese. He was present, frail and visibly weakened by captivity, at the Japanese surrender ceremony in 1945. August 1942. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, pushes into Stalingrad, a city that has become, for Hitler, an objective of symbolic as much as strategic importance. By November, the Sixth Army is deep inside the city, fighting block by block in conditions of grinding attrition that have consumed both sides for months. On November 19th, the Soviet Operation Uranus encircles the Sixth Army entirely. 300,000 German troops are cut off. Paulus requests permission to break out. Hitler refuses. He orders the Sixth Army to hold its position, promises a relief effort, and promotes Paulus to Field Marshal, a rank that carried an implicit expectation. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus surrendered on February 2, 1943. The relief effort had failed. The Luftwaffe's promise, delivered personally by Göring, to supply the encircled army by air, had proven catastrophically inadequate. The required daily tonnage was never approached. Men froze. Ammunition ran out. The Sixth Army was destroyed not in battle but in stasis, waiting for a rescue that logistics had made impossible from the first day it was promised. Paulus spent the rest of the war in Soviet captivity, eventually becoming a vocal critic of the Nazi regime in broadcasts aimed at German troops. He settled in East Germany after his release in 1953 and died in Dresden in 1957. Whether his decision to hold rather than attempt a breakout was military obedience, personal paralysis, or rational calculation under impossible conditions remains one of the most argued questions in the history of the Eastern Front. Hermann Göring made two promises during the Second World War that determined the fate of major military operations. He kept neither of them. The first came at Dunkirk in May 1940. With the British Expeditionary Force trapped on the beaches of northern France, Göring personally assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could destroy the encircled army from the air without the need for a ground assault. Hitler accepted the argument and halted the Panzer advance for 3 critical days. The Luftwaffe could not deliver. Weather, RAF resistance, and the limits of air power over a defended coastal perimeter allowed more than 300,000 Allied troops to evacuate. They would return. The second promise came at Stalingrad. When Paulus's army was encircled in November 1942, Göring assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the Sixth Army by air, a minimum of 500 tons per day. The actual daily delivery never consistently exceeded a fraction of that figure. The airlift was undermined by Soviet air defenses, the distance from viable airfields, inadequate transport aircraft, and the fundamental impossibility of supplying a force of that size by air in winter conditions. Göring had made the assurance, historians have since concluded, largely to protect his own standing with Hitler rather than on any credible operational assessment. He was convicted at Nuremberg and died the night before his scheduled execution in October 1946. The promises at Dunkirk and Stalingrad had, between them, contributed to the loss of the war he had claimed the Luftwaffe could win. 4 generals, 4 decisions, and between them, consequences measured in hundreds of thousands of lives and the redirection of a global conflict. What connects Gamelin, Percival, Paulus, and Göring is not incompetence in the ordinary sense. Each operated within constraints of politics, doctrine, and command pressure that shaped every calculation they made. What distinguishes them is the moment of refusal, the refusal to adapt, to challenge, to act against the logic of the system they served. Military history tends to search for the decisive commander, the inspired decision, the turning point. It is perhaps equally instructive to study the opposite, the moment when a decision was not made, a promise was not questioned, an assumption was not tested. Those moments, too, can determine the outcome of a war. Which of these four stories do you find most difficult to look away from? Let us know in the comments. And if you'd like to go deeper into the hidden figures of the Second World War, subscribe. There's much more still to uncover.